So what do we come here for on a Sunday morning? There's a question. It's a question with a lot of potential answers, and well, it's not actually the question I'm going to try to answer in any comprehensive way this morning. But in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, in the chapter that we're going to read from in a few moments, Paul gives one very important answer to that question, when he's thinking in particular about how we all contribute to worship. Because we all do contribute. I mean, for a start, we contribute simply by being present. I mean, that is a contribution, an important one. Also by the many ways in which we do interact with each other as we meet together on a Sunday, around our service. And yes, for some of us, through specific roles and responsibilities that we have on a Sunday. But the point is, we all have a contribution to make. And the purpose of that contribution, Paul tells us, is to build up the church. In other words, to make a positive contribution to the health and the life of this church. And we can all do that. Paul is speaking in this chapter more specifically about the use of spiritual gifts in worship. In other words, the God-given talents and abilities that we all have. Whether they're the more obvious, upfront sort of gifts, such as preaching, teaching, playing instruments, or the more behind-the-scenes or lower-key ones, such as an ability to encourage others, or simply to help others in various ways, serving in all kinds of practical ways. These are listed too in the Bible as gifts, spiritual gifts. And Paul is adamant that however we're gifted by God and however we contribute, when we gather together, our aim must always be to speak and to act for the common good, for the good of each other. It therefore might even mean, as we'll see later, choosing not to use certain gifts and abilities on occasion, if in doing so we might detract from worship that builds up the whole congregation. And by speaking in this way, he takes the emphasis away completely from coming along on a Sunday for whatever we might get out of it personally. Now, that's not meaning to say, I'm sure, that that isn't a benefit we should expect from coming together. Of course not. Coming together regularly in worship, joining together, is vital for our own personal spiritual health. Nevertheless, our mindset as we come, our priority must be that we come offering ourselves to God and therefore to one another, to the body, to use that biblical illustration, in any way that we can, wanting to make our contribution to building up the church. Well, that's certainly the conclusion I've reached from reading through this particular chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians. And in a moment we really will read some of it, but not just yet, because just a little bit more scene setting I want to do. Because in this chapter Paul focuses on two particular gifts, those being prophecy and tongues, as they are called. And whenever we're dealing with those things, well, I like to give a little bit of explanation, although we're not going to be focusing on those as such. But I mean, prophecy, when we read that in the New Testament, really, it's simply one person conveying a message from God to another, or conveying a message to the church. It happens in various ways. Maybe usually we think of it of a sudden flash of inspiration that somebody has. Maybe it's a thought, it might be a verse, it might be a picture. Our prayer team are doing that when they pray, as we've mentioned already. And if we believe it might be from God, well, we'll share it with the person or the church if we think that's right. But, prophetic words can also come from serious thought and study. Don't let's just think it's got to be a sudden flash. Not at all. It can even come unknowingly in our conversations before and after the service, perhaps. God might use our words to suddenly speak to somebody in a very particular way. And, when we're in worship, I'm always happy for people to come up to me and say, Dave, I think I've got something I really ought to share this morning. It happens from time to time. Okay, we've got to do it in an orderly way, but, do come and ask, if you feel you ought to share something in worship. But those prophetic words, again, will come during the preaching, during our prayers, people will be hit by words that are for you on a Sunday, you know. When somebody is speaking in tongues, you know, really bypass the conscious mind in a way. And yet those sounds convey very powerfully from the speaker a sense of love and adoration and gratitude towards God. It's a pouring out of the heart and soul to God. And some in our congregation have experienced that gift, that ability. Alongside that, some are sometimes given an ability to interpret what is said as well. That might be their own words or those of another. So that's what speaking in tongues is. And, well, if you want to know more about those things, speak to me afterwards. But that's just a little introduction. Because Paul speaks about the use of, these two gifts in particular, but partly in order to make a more general point, I believe, about how we all contribute in worship. But yes, also because there seemed to be a particular problem at Corinth surrounding the attitude towards and the use of these gifts in worship. Yes, I'm afraid another problem in Corinth. Those of you who have been following this series, in this letter, you'll know there were lots of problems in this church that Paul has to address. Felt he'd got to correct the church on and instruct them on. Various things were dividing the congregation there. He'd also had to rebuke them for their pride and their boasting sometimes, sadly. Well, one other thing that seems to be happening there is that some spiritual gifts are being seen as superior to others. Maybe even to the extent that some Christians are seen as being, on a bit of a better level than others. One such gift, it seems, was this speaking in tongues. Furthermore, we get the impression that some were exhibiting their gifts in public worship, frankly, just to show off, rather than to make a beneficial contribution to everybody. Because, and this is the key point I think, they were focused on their own personal worship experience rather than how they might help draw everybody into worship and enhance everybody's experience of worship. Actually, we've already met this kind of attitude once in 1 Corinthians already. If you remember back in chapter 11, Paul talking about communion, and when we simply share bread and wine in communion, some were so focused on their own worship at that time, they were completely overlooking some of the poor people in their congregation. So a similar kind of thing, really. And now Paul continues on from that and addresses this issue of the misuse of gifts. And he does so in a pretty comprehensive manner. In chapter 12, we've already looked at that, he sets out some general principles about the use of gifts as he describes the church as a body, all different parts of a body, you may remember. And he explains there that although each person has a different contribution to make, each contribution is equally valuable, whatever it is. That was important from chapter 12. Chapter 13, which for various reasons I'm doing next week, slightly out of order, for various reasons, but it's that wonderful chapter on love and the priority of love within the church, and that the requirement that to love one another, actually that's, is more important than any use of our gifts in church. So I think it's pretty obvious from that when it comes to, prophecy versus tongues, prophecy wins hands down in worship, because Paul tells us here, worship is about strengthening, encouraging and comforting each other, and it's about the whole church being edified. In other words, that we can all increase our understanding of the Christian faith when we come together. So, as we come together, on this occasion, we must all come thinking, how can I contribute towards the strengthening, the encouraging, the comforting of and the edification of others in the congregation? How can I help in building up the church in these ways? And I'm sure you can imagine already there's many different ways in which we can all come and contribute in that sense. So, in our praying and in our singing too, the aim must be to draw in the whole church closer to God in praise and thanksgiving, so that we can all say Amen to what we hear. That's important that we're together in that. Once again, we must seek each other's edification in the faith, Paul says, through the words of our songs and our prayers, for example. Always that sense of doing what we do together as God's people for each other, with a kind of a generosity of heart, if you like, which wants to help those alongside us benefit from our worship. That's wonderful, isn't it? Always with Paul, always we see the priority of mission, of evangelism, a great passion to see people come to faith in Jesus Christ. And, that passion needs to be in our hearts too, of course. And when we come together to worship as much as any other time, our worship must be conducted in such a way that's, accessible to newcomers, to those whose understanding of the Christian faith isn't so great, that it will help them in that understanding. It must also serve as a vehicle to actually introducing people to Jesus and the basic gospel message, the good news of Jesus, which can convict them of their sin and need of forgiveness and save them. Most challenging of all, perhaps, to us is that thought that our worship should be such that it will be evident to people who come that God is among us. That's a challenge, isn't it? But it's possible, Paul is telling us, through the way we worship and the way we are with one another, for people to discern that God is among us. So Paul, still focusing on prophecy and tongues, but does start to list down here now a lot of other ways that people can contribute to worship from within the congregation. But once again, the same important point to make. In verse 26, all of this must be done for the strengthening of the church. And then in 31, so that everyone may be instructed and encouraged. There is also an insistence in this, that last section, that everything must be done in an orderly way. And I'm sure Paul is saying that for the same reason, same purpose in mind, because doing things in an orderly way helps again to build up the whole church during worship. There is, of course, there also the understanding that a number of people do contribute to worship in one way or another when we come together. So, I hope you found that way of sort of doing the reading and unpacking the chapter edifying this morning, to use Paul's word. Do go away and give this some consideration. Do a bit of self-examination of your own attitude as you come to worship on a Sunday morning. Does it kind of accord with the general essence of Paul's teaching here? I mean, let me make it clear once again. Worship is vital, it's essential for the health and nurture of our own personal relationship with God. We do come to give him thanks and praise for what he's done in our own lives. We come with open ears to see what he's got to say to us personally. But before ever we can be in a position to receive from God in that kind of way, I believe we must come first of all with the attitude of giving, offering ourselves to God, which means also offering ourselves to one another with a desire to contribute and to help in building up the whole church. And there's all sorts of practical outworkings of that principle. Within the service itself, that all who participate must come, not focused on themselves, but with the good of all in mind. So important for me, leading, a good part of the service. I'm not here just to look good and get praises from you, or focus on pet topics that interest me. It must be about what I believe through prayer is genuinely good for us all. It's a challenge to prepare worship that's going to hopefully be suitable for all ages, for example, as well, and all levels of understanding of the faith, even those who have no faith. But again, we must be trying to do that so that all are included and built up. The musicians and the singers, they're not here to enjoy themselves. They know that by playing, but to help, again, draw us all into worship. That's why they do some of our newer songs before we start worship. That's, just so they start familiarising us, for example, with the songs we're going to sing later. So many things helpful. The AV operators, Phil this morning, thank you, Phil. In fact, his first morning doing the whole job, so that's really great. But Phil's not come to indulge himself in his own personal interest in IT, but to help our worship to run smoothly, to facilitate it. We don't expect everybody to do perfectly. It's not about being perfect, but it's that our heart is there, wanting to do our best for everyone. There is also in this teaching that encouragement to involve as many as possible in worship. It's not just the minister who should be doing all the preaching and praying, etc. And there should be that open invitation that I mentioned earlier on for people to feel that they can come and contribute when they're prompted to. Bearing in mind that Paul does say it should happen in an orderly way. But there are all those surrounding tasks around the service as well. You know, those who do set the church out for worship, those who welcome us in at the door, even in the car park as we come in, those who serve us coffee and tea afterwards, etc., etc. All that needs to be done with that genuine desire to do so for the good of the congregation. We might think that these are seemingly minor roles, but they're very important in enhancing that worship experience for everyone. Because the general fellowship around the service, you know, before and after, is all part of it. The conversations we have with each other on a Sunday morning can be so beneficial in so many ways. And, you know, this task that Paul says about of strengthening and encouraging and comforting one another, we can do a lot of that in our conversations too. And when we think about that priority of mission and evangelism, you know, the opportunities for promoting that run right through the service and everything that surrounds it as we welcome those who are new. And again, the content of the service is trying to use language that will be understandable to even those who are perhaps new to us. And the style of service itself made me think of the cafe-style service we had a few weeks ago. And, you know, we will do that again in the future. Try and improve it, yes. But, you know, we didn't hold that service because we thought it was going to be everybody's preferred way of worship. In fact, maybe nobody's preferred way of worship. We weren't doing it for that. We were doing it. We thought it might be a nice style of service to introduce newcomers to welcome people who perhaps aren't used to a normal church service. So, you know, the success and failure of that service should be judged on that basis, not whether individually we found the most helpful style of service. Just another thing, you know, that comes under this general principle that Paul's bringing out here. So many thoughts been going around in my head as I've studied this chapter. I hope it's given you all some food for thought as you go. Especially that thought that as we come to a Sunday service, you know, we come as we are, we come as the person God has made us. That's with those gifts and abilities we have, but also our knowledge and our experiences, our personalities too. And we come to worship God with all of that, but we come to play our part in the overall worship experience of all. We come to contribute, bringing all that God has made us to be and offering it to Him and to others. Wanting to give what we can to that common goal of building up our church, building us up in every way, so that we might truly be the people that God wants us to be, that loving community, intent on serving Him.